Welcome one and welcome all to this Season 12, Episode 15 of the Ubuntu Podcast. It is Tuesday the 16th of July, and this week we are going to be rounding up news from our community, some events, and some of our picks from the news headlines. Joining me to chew through all of that are Mark.
Hello.
Hello, how are you?
I am not bad at all, although I'm a little bit warm.
Yes, it is a bit warm. And sadly, no Alan again tonight.
Ah.
Yeah, oh dear indeed. So, thankfully, our friend Stuart Langridge is joining us. Hello, Stuart.
Hello.
How are you?
I am not too bad, although a little bit warm.
Yes, it is a bit close around here at the moment. Stuart, we always ask, at the little intro sections here, what people have been up to. So what have you been up to recently?
I've been playing with QEMU.
Oh, right. For what purpose?
I'm trying to work out whether there's a relatively easy way that I can build a very tiny Linux distribution to run a bunch of little applications that I need and then ship that disk image and QEMU across different platforms.
Ah.
So someone on Windows, someone on Mac, someone on whatever gets all the stuff that I want them to have, but I'm not doing it by making a Mac version or a Windows version. I'm basically building a tiny Linux distribution and then running that inside QEMU on the different platform. So far, signs point to yes, but it may be more troublesome than I think.
Isn't this what Docker is for?
Absolutely. And if you can think of a sensible way to ship an application to an ordinary user which bundles Docker and does this, then get stuck in.
I see.
As far as I can tell, I mean, that's possible, but you've got to be some kind of uber Docker wizard to understand how to do that. The idea behind Docker is that it gets set up by the person at the other end. Right? And this is not a thing I'm building for developers.
Right.
So I can't assume that Docker is in place. It's the same thing. The same reason I can't use LXD or multipass or whatever like that. You want something where I can just ship them a thing and it works relatively easy. I don't have to do a bunch of complicated work to understand how it ties into the virtualization on the system, whatever. So if I just ship a QEMU binary and a disk image, it works. Is the theory. I'm sure I'll now get 100 emails explaining how this other virtualization technology is a million times better and I'm useless and mostly don't care, but I'm happy to listen.
Okay, I can think of one. I'm not going to give it to you now. I'm going to put this out to the audience, explain to Stuart how he should be doing this. We'll accept the feedback. We'll read it out. I know Stuart listens, so one way or another, he'll get to hear your advice.
Well, I've listened up to now.
Oh.
I might stop when I get repeatedly abused by the Ubuntu podcast audience. But yes, I would be interested in hearing your viewpoints.
And Mark, what have you been up to?
I bought a new phone for the first time in, I'm going to say 5 years.
Wow. So what was your outgoing phone and why did you replace it?
My outgoing phone was a OnePlus One.
Oh, right. Okay.
It developed a fault whereby it would turn itself off and not turn itself back on again until I opened it up and disconnected the battery, which I realised wasn't a particularly sustainable way of using my phone.
That seems annoying. Did you not contact them and say, this is obviously not my fault, fix it?
Having replaced the battery once myself, I thought that might not go down so well.
I tell you what, I had OnePlus X.
Yeah.
And before I bought it, I received no end of feedback from people saying OnePlus have the worst customer support ever. And then something went wrong with my OnePlus X, and I said, something's gone wrong with it, and everyone said, now you'll see. And it turned out they were just great.
Oh, really?
That I filled in the little live chat thing on their website, and a chap sent me a box with a prepaid label on it. I put the phone in the box on a Monday, and it was back with me on a Thursday, perfectly working. I was blown away by how good service this was.
Okay, well, maybe I'll try that.
Wouldn't hurt.
Yeah, now that it doesn't really matter so much. The other thing is I figured, I've repaired it a couple of times. I've kept it going for 5 years, and that's pretty good innings for a smartphone. So I don't feel too bad about getting a new one. And the new one I got was a reconditioned OnePlus 5T.
Oh, very nice too.
Yes, which is not bigger, which is good. I didn't want it to be any bigger, and quite fast and neat. And yeah. I quite like it. I didn't think I'd find something that I'd like quite as much as I like the OnePlus One, and I'm not sure I have yet. But this will certainly do.
I'm just going to channel my inner Joe Ressington and ask, are you using Oxygen OS or have you flashed it with Lineage?
At the moment, I'm using Oxygen OS because, I tried it out. Well, my OnePlus One came with Cyanogen OS, which I then replaced with Cyanogen Mod and eventually Lineage. And the latest version of Lineage had been a bit unstable on the OnePlus One, whereas Oxygen OS on the 5T is extremely quick and stable, and it's missing some key features which I really like in Lineage. So yeah, I'm wondering whether I want to take the risk of it not being as stable for the features that I really like. I'll have to see how that goes.
Yeah, I've been using OnePlus phones since the OnePlus 3 and I've always stuck with Oxygen. It's been pretty great and it's got some really useful features. Anyway, enough talk of phones and hypervisors. Let's get on with the rest of the show. And now it's time for some community news and events. So, I noticed, just as we finished recording the last episode, Debian 10 Buster was finally released. Have either of you taken a look at Debian 10?
I personally haven't, but I'm glad it's out because presumably that all gets rolled into Ubuntu now. Fingers crossed.
Yes, I mean, obviously, stuff from Debian unstable continues to flow into Ubuntu, but there's been something of a protracted logjam there because the Debian archive gets frozen and therefore the body of new things flowing into Ubuntu sort of, dries up for that spell whilst we're waiting for, Debian to get their release out and then unfreeze their archive. Which is what we do, when we release Ubuntu, but as a downstream to Debian, that has a knock-on effect for us. So yeah, that's all sorted now. Mark, have you given it a go?
I haven't given it a go, but I saw some interesting things which are in this release. One that interested me in particular was they've been working on a reproducible builds project so that you can basically guarantee that the source that they publish is in fact the source that was used to build the binary that you get from them. Because while a piece of software may be open source, you can't guarantee that in between the source that you saw and the compiled binary, they didn't just say, oh, well, just before I compile it, I'll add some, tracking code or a Bitcoin miner or something like that, and then I'll compile it and send you that and you won't know the difference. The thing they said, they've managed to get to the point where 91% of the source packages that they distribute will produce exactly the same bit for bit binary that you're getting.
It's impressive.
It's also quite useful beyond the whole reflections on trusting trust thing. It's quite a useful idea to have reproducible builds anyway. First of all, because it flushes out a bunch of stuff in the build systems where we're just kind of generating random things. They fixed a whole bunch of bugs. But secondly, because if you've got an archive of software and you rebuild a bunch of it, but a lot of it hasn't actually changed, then the binaries won't change either, which means that mirroring that archive is easier to do and downloads are smaller and so on and so forth.
Yeah, it's all good stuff.
Reproducible builds are basically a great idea. They're just a nightmare to make happen.
Yes.
I mean, they've been working on the reproducible builds project for years and years and years and years, but it's got a real fillip in the last couple of years, I think. And once they hit the point of going, okay, the whole Debian archive is reproducible, it's then going to be bad if someone tries to do something which isn't. The seesaw tips over to the point where it's like, okay, this is now the norm, and deviation from this norm is a problem. Rather than the moment you go, well, I'd like to do reproducible builds, but it's just too hard. The answer will be, but you have to. Everyone else has.
So how do you feel about Wayland being the default display server in this release when you use GNOME, which I believe is the default desktop environment?
Shrug.
Shrug. Don't care.
No, I find it very hard to get excited about what are they called? Display servers.
That's what they're called, apparently.
I nearly said window managers, but I'd have got emails.
Yeah.
I'll be honest with you. I like the idea in theory of moving on because it's the way the world's going, but I'm happy to just sit back and let the Ubuntu desktop team choose when it's ready, and they said it wasn't ready for the last release. and it's probably not going to be in 2004, as I understand it.
That's my understanding, yeah.
So my inclination is to say, well, I'm not going to have an opinion. They're the professionals. I'm going to listen. So it's interesting that Debian have decided that it is good enough to be the default for them. I don't know whether that's a function of the different types of users, or Debian think they've got more technical users who are more prepared to deal with it, or they're more prepared to accept potentially breaking changes in order to push things forward, or what? Don't know. But it'll be interesting to see how it shakes out.
Yeah, I think it's great that you've now got Fedora and Debian shipping Wayland by default, because it's exposing Wayland to more users, and therefore the rough edges that exist are probably going to brought into sharp focus where those are.
Yeah, I hope that what we get from that is people using those OSs saying, okay, how can we work with this and make it better and so on, rather than doing the thing you need to do when you first install Fedora is to uninstall Wayland and install Xtorg. Like how Pulse Audio used to be, when it's kind of, yes, it's not finished yet, but we're never going to get it finished unless we put it in a thing that real people use. And so you got a million blog posts every time there was an Ubuntu release saying, well, this is how to remove all this stuff that they've done where they're forcing broken technology on us. I hope that the community support for Wayland by default is not like that.
Well, we shall find out in due course.
We will. It'll be really interesting.
What did you find in the news this week, Stuart?
Well, since I was just talking about the Ubuntu desktop team, Will Cook, manager of the Ubuntu desktop team, wrote a really rather nice message on Twitter. They did an Ubuntu developer survey and got a whole bunch of responses to specific questions and so on. But one of the questions was a free-form text box, just tell us what you think. And obviously, someone's going to sit there and read through them all, but he also wanted to get a sense of the kinds of things that people were saying a lot. And so he did a bunch of text analysis on it and pulled out common phrases and so on. And apparently the most common word pairing entered into that thing that's being fed back to Ubuntu was the phrase thank you.
Isn't that lovely?
And I thought that was really nice. I mean, a lot of the news I see about... Well, the news I see about literally everything on Earth at the moment, but specifically about software, about Ubuntu, about Linux. It's all very negative. You've got people making YouTube videos decrying things, and there's very little in the way of, wow, this is actually a nice thing, kind of pleasant news rather than sniping. And this was just a nice thing that floated across my desk that day, and I went, oh, that's really nice. Hooray. It gives me back a little bit of faith in the Ubuntu community as being a nice community to be part of.
By and large, I think the Ubuntu community are lovely. I think you'll find there are some vociferous individuals who've got platforms and an agenda, and that's what we hear a lot about, some of the sniping, as you put it, which is unfortunate because that does demoralize people, and having thousands of messages saying thank you certainly has the inverse in that it lifts your spirits.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly the thing that we hear a lot about, and I've spoken a lot about how it is the vociferous minority, the loud minority, the peanut gallery, who are there casting aspersions, and they're the only people who get heard. And there's this huge mass of people who use Ubuntu and love it, but they don't shout about that and don't get involved in some of these more unpleasant discussions, and so you don't hear about it. And this was a nice chance to remind myself that these small minority of voices are genuinely a small minority of voices.
I agree. Mark, what did you find in the news this week?
Well, there's been a lot of fuss made about this, especially in the gaming community, because Ubuntu is going to start shipping the latest version of the Nvidia proprietary graphics driver in the LTS versions. So this means at the moment you can go into the updates manager and there's a tab for additional drivers, and you can select the Nvidia driver if you've got an Nvidia card, and it'll install the driver for you, but it is fixed to whatever whatever was stable when the LTS came out, whereas now it's going to, once you've done that, it's going to just be updated to the latest stable version using the stable release updates mechanism like you get with things like Firefox.
This is true, yeah. I think this is fantastic. As an owner of several computers that have Nvidia cards in them, I'm delighted about this.
Yes, very good work.
I have no insight into how this happened, but I'm assuming it probably wasn't that difficult technically, but there was a whole bunch of complicated legal stuff behind the scenes in order to permit redistribution of the drivers. Because as I understand it, it's in the repository now, right? This is not a you install Ubuntu and then you can install the Nvidia drivers afterwards. It comes with an Ubuntu image.
So, there's a couple of changes, right? So this one in particular, this change is that the Nvidia drivers are available in the repository. So no change there. We've had that for a while. The difference is, as newer Nvidia drivers come out, they will automatically be SRU'd into the archive, into the LTS releases and the current supported releases, so that you always have access to the latest drivers.
Because before you had to add a PPA, was it, which had the latest drivers published into it?
Right. And that was really a staging area where the latest drivers were being, the packaging for those was being tested before they went into whatever the next release of Ubuntu was. But we did have to approach Nvidia for permission to do this second thing, which is in Ubuntu 19.10, and in fact in 1904 as well, the Nvidia drivers are available for install at the point of, as you're installing the OS, you can tick a box that says, give me third-party drivers, and if you have an Nvidia card, you get the drivers. But from 19.10 onwards, those drivers are actually going to be seeded in the ISO image. So even if you're doing an offline install, those Nvidia drivers will be available to you. And for that piece, we did seek permission from Nvidia that we were able to redistribute their drivers on the ISO images.
And I did think it was quite nice that a couple of the downstream distributions, OSs who base themselves on Ubuntu. So Ubuntu, most of the packages are Ubuntu packages. I saw a couple of them saying, "Hey, we get this too now. That's great. Thanks, Ubuntu." And I thought that was rather nice.
Yes, that was Linux Mint, Elementary, and Zorin all chipped in to say, thanks for that. So that was lovely to see as well. And one other advantage of not having to use that PPA anymore is that when NVIDIA drivers are published in the Ubuntu archive, those kernel modules are signed. So it's now possible to have the latest NVIDIA drivers without having to disable Secure Boot. Now, something else that I saw today, in fact, is that Ubuntu WSL is a meta package that's being introduced to Ubuntu specifically to improve the experience of Ubuntu when it's running on WSL.
Which is actually pretty cool. I mean, I didn't realise that there was this there was this little package, but I saw the same thing you did today, and that's quite. It does things like it lets you easily write files out onto the Windows desktop and things like that, right?
Yeah, create shortcuts to utilities or launch URLs in the default browser in Windows from WSL. This is an initiative from the Foundations team so that, we can try and smooth those gaps between where you're using Ubuntu in WSL and its interaction with Windows. And part of that is facilitated through WSLU, which is the WSL utilities. But also, they've stood up a wiki page which actually describes some neat little tricks that you can do to get audio working inside WSL or connect to graphical applications and things like that. So I think this is probably going to evolve, and it's one to keep an eye on. So we'll have links to the blog post from Balint, who's in the Ubuntu Foundations team, who's been working on this, and also a link to the wiki page where you can find out more of the tricks and tips of what you can do with WSL.
Finally, I can exclusively reveal here on the Ubuntu podcast that Ubuntu MATE 19.10 is coming to the GPD MicroPC.
This is true.
And now, I could obviously tell you all about this myself, but I feel like, Martin, you might also have something to say about this.
Yeah, so this is another GPD device. So they've been making netbook-style devices for a few years now. Their first netbook crowdfunder, the GPD Pocket, actually had an option to ship with Ubuntu or with Windows. So obviously lots of Ubuntu users backed that campaign, and it was hugely successful. I think GPD would hold their hand up and say they didn't do the greatest job in terms of how they delivered the Ubuntu experience on those devices. And the community picked up the slack there. And I got involved in that effort, and I've produced images for the Pocket and the Pocket 2 of Ubuntu MATE. And through that, I've established this relationship with them. So they've now started sending me engineering samples of their upcoming devices. And this is one that's just exiting their crowdfunding at the moment and just starting to be shipped to their backers. So I've had one of these for a few months, and it required some kernel work. So I think we'll have an alpha image for that available in the next week or so for people to come and install.
So is this the same form factor as the Pocket, or is this like a desktop?
Oh, no, it's smaller. It's a 6-inch netbook style device, and it's got some interesting properties because it has an old style VGA port and HDMI port and a serial port and an Ethernet port and lots of USB connectivity. And I think what this device is really aimed at is network admins that want to, go to, say, a router that is down or needs configuring, and they have this small device they can pull out and they can connect it to these things and solve problems. So I think it's your on-the-go, troubleshooting device. But actually, it's pretty decent performance for such a tiny little gizmo.
And just so I understand this, is the idea that they will be distributing Ubuntu MATE on this device, or you've got an image, so if someone buys one of these, they can then install Ubuntu MATE themselves?
Yes, so the way it works is we publish bespoke images, bespoke ISO images for these devices because they require some specific enablement. They're available on our download page, but also GPD add them to their firmware downloads page on their website so people can find them there as well. So you'll find them right next to the Windows firmware for their devices.
That's really cool.
Now, we've got a couple of events. What's the first event, Mark?
The first event is UbuCon Europe, which is happening the 10th to the 13th of October in Sintra in Portugal.
This is true, and I'm reliably informed by their organising committee that the first batch of talks has been accepted. And contrary to what I said on the podcast 2 weeks ago, their call for papers is still open, and it's open until the 31st of July. So if you're intending to go to UbuCon Europe, get your call for papers forms filled out. My talk has been accepted, so I am going to Portugal.
Very cool. And then the other event is OlkaCamp 19, which is the 19th and the 20th of October 2019, which is in Manchester at the Pendulum Hotel.
Yes, and I saw that the ticket purchasing experience is extremely slick and effortless. So I gave that a go, and it's rather fantastic. So if you want to support the event by buying an optional ticket, buy one now. Now's a good time to do that. And that is the end of the community news and events. And now it's time for some news headlines, our picks from the tech news. Now, I noticed with great disappointment that Mozilla has been branded Internet Villain for supporting DNS privacy features. What on earth is all this about?
This came from the Internet Service Provider Association in the UK, who I'd never heard of before this, but it basically appears to be an industry group for ISPs who are upset that Mozilla is supporting something called DNS over HTTPS, or DOH, which is essentially a way of securing DNS requests. So even though you might be requesting a website in a secure connection, so people can't see the content of the page that you're getting, they can still see the request that you're making to look up the IP address of that site. So this is a way of quite a higher level than normal, I think, because normally DNS requests are handled sort of by the OS, but this is a way at the moment for your browser to make those requests over a secure connection so that they can't be observed. And apparently this could allow people to bypass some of those incredibly unbreakable filters that we have on content in the UK that stop you doing things like going to the Pirate Bay.
It's a touch more nuanced than this, but what's interesting about this is that it should be some kind of case study in how not to do PR. There are genuine issues with the idea of DNS over HTTPS. There are genuine concerns in the sysadmin community and people who run large networks about it changing the seat of trust, the people who own the DNS from your operating system to your browser without necessarily that being a good idea or without thinking about the ramifications of that and so on and so forth. Secondly, the ISPA have been doing this internet villain thing for about 20 years now, and they reckon it's this kind of light-hearted way to draw attention to some issues in the world, tech issues, which they think should be discussed. However, they massively underestimated the catastrophic amount of pushback they would get about this, and have since written a semi-apologetic blog post where they say, we thought it was just quite funny and then everyone hated us, we don't understand it. As far as I can tell, it's like you think, okay, Greggs have changed the recipe on their steak bakes, and I was having a perfectly reasonable discussion with them about that, and then I called them history's greatest monsters, and now they won't listen to me anymore. So, as an example, Andrews and Arnold, who are an expensive but extremely technically competent ISP here in the UK, they're not members of the ISPA, and they donated the fee for ISPA membership, which is £2,940. They donated that to Mozilla to support the work they're doing. So there should be a discussion about this, and there needs to be a discussion about this. Part of the basis for that discussion will be having an implementation of it so people can see what it's like. And that's what Mozilla are doing. And I think the ISPA have learned maybe don't do this sort of thing in the future.
So I've been using DNS over HTTPS on my phone for a few months now.
Because you can get an app which will do it, can't you?
Yeah, you can get an app that's published by Cloudware, and it's called 1.1.1.1, and it hooks up that DNS server, and you can choose whether you want to resolve DNS over HTTPS or whether you want to use DNS over TLS. And the reason I installed this is that I was staying in a hotel where when I connected to the hotel Wi-Fi, it was jamming all sorts of, forced redirects and pages embedded into, the browser and what have you. And by using DNS over HTTPS, all of that just went away. So that's how I came to start using it, but I've actually found it to be genuinely useful. So sort of not a VPN, because none of my, stuff that's going over HTTPS is encrypted, of course, but it's kind of like a VPN in that you can get to things that you're being actively restricted from getting to, which in my case, the hotel wasn't allowing me to get to Netflix, which I was none too impressed with.
Yes, so hopefully lessons learned on all sides about this sort of thing. So the next thing, people who listen to open source podcasts, and I'm assuming that everyone listening to this understands this concept, may be aware of a thing called gpodder.net, which is a podcast directory. It's open source. It's been running for quite a few years, and it's essentially like the iTunes podcast directory. There are a bunch of podcast clients which use it as, if you're searching for podcasts, you can search gpodder.net for it. So AntennaPod does it, Amarok does it, a bunch of others, so on and so forth. Anyway, Stefan Kergel, who is the maintainer of it, is now looking for someone to take it over because he doesn't have time to develop it anymore. It's a Python web app, and the thing he says is that if no one steps up to maintain it, it might end up shutting down by the end of the year.
This is quite responsible open source stewardship, though, right? Somebody acknowledges that they don't have the time to work on this, and instead of just ending and bit rotting, this is fair notice to find people in the community who may be interested in taking this project on.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And if nobody steps up, then okay, that's unfortunate, but best efforts were made to find a new owner.
You realistically can't ask for more of this. And gpodder's pretty cool. As I say, it's been around for a long time now. And Stephen Michael Keller wrote a blog post about why it's cool. And you're listening to an open source podcast right now, but if you're using an open source podcast client to do it, then it probably has GPod integration. If you're listening to it in iTunes, then it probably doesn't. But nonetheless, it's a nice service, and it would be a shame to see it go away. So I hope someone who's interested in open source podcasting and the impression I have is that it's not a great deal of work to keep this thing going.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, Stuart. Somebody who's interested in open source podcasting that's got Python, web technology, database skills. If only I could think of somebody, called Stuart Langridge who had all of those skills and interests.
I will point out that I read this when it was released, and I went and looked at it and I thought about it, but I just don't have the time.
Yeah.
I did actually consider it.
I thought you might have done. It does seem right up your street.
But I am unfortunately not in a position to take on additional responsibilities. But if someone who would be interested in doing this, and there's a bunch of stuff which could be done to make it cooler, which Stefan hasn't done for the last few years because he's not had that much time to do improvements and other development on it. But if you wanted to add features to it, or if you've looked at GPod and thought, I wish it did this, now's your chance.
A bit of a sad story now. The Raspberry Pi 4 doesn't work with some USB-C cables.
That is unfortunate. What happened?
Well, we were talking about the Raspberry Pi, new Raspberry Pi, quite a lot on the last show, and I was very excited about the fact that it was using USB-C like I had predicted it would. But it turns out that the way that the USB-C is implemented on the board isn't compatible with some cables and chargers which have something called E-marking. And this means that basically there's some cleverness that goes on in signaling between the charger and the thing you're plugging it into, which tries to understand what kind of device it is before it provides it with power. And the way the Raspberry Pi's wiring is set up, it thinks it's an audio adapter rather than a computer which needs lots of amps sending its way. So then it doesn't.
I was really, really cross about this because a whole bunch of people were kind of, oh, well, USB-C is so hard. Why doesn't anyone get it right? It's just so complicated, but there's all these different cables and some work with other ones and whatever. And I can imagine whoever's responsible for the USB-C spec sitting there going, it's perfectly clear in the specification what you're meant to do. The fact that, yes, cables are hard is because you keep buying cheap cables that don't implement it right. And something like the Raspberry Pi, which has got to be in with a shout of the computer which has sold more than any other individual computer ever, can't even get the cable right. I mean, for goodness sake, there is a spec. I was really surprised that they got this wrong. And as far as I can tell, it's the Pi team's fault. They just didn't build the socket right.
Yeah, it's been positioned that they were trying to take a shortcut by not using 2 resistors or something and using 1. I don't understand these things really. I have no appreciation for electronics whatsoever.
I don't either. I mean, I'd be quite happy to sit here and say, yeah, it's because of the shared pull-down CC resistor. But I've got no idea what any of it means. But as far as I can tell, based on my not very much knowledge about this, yeah, they either took a shortcut or just didn't read the specs properly, or got gear which didn't read the specs properly, or whatever. And because they're going to fix it in a future board revision. But oh dear, Raspberry Pi Foundation, don't do this sort of thing.
It's unfortunate.
There is a very detailed explanation as to exactly the electronic reasons for why this has happened, which we can link to in the show notes. But yeah, until there is a Raspberry Pi 4 Plus or something, you're best off getting an official Raspberry Pi charger if you want to be sure that it'll work, I think.
I don't think it will require a whole new iteration, an uplift on the board, I think, because I've got board revisions for earlier models where they're 1.0 and then other boards are 1.1 and then they're 1.2 and they're all Raspberry Pi 2s, but they're subtly different. So I imagine this will start, rolling out the next time they do a manufacturing run or something.
Are you a freedom-hating iTunes user? Redeem yourself by helping spread the word about Ubuntu and open source. Leave a rating to tell others what you think of the Ubuntu podcast.
Thanks very much, Stuart, for joining us. Are you going to be able to come back next week as well?
I reckon I probably could do that, yes.
That's great, because next week we are going to be interviewing Martin Dougiamis about Moodle, something that Mark has mentioned a few times, and we wanted to find out more about it. If you want to contact us and send us your feedback, you can do that by emailing us at show@ubuntupodcast.org. And if you're looking for a way to support the show, then why don't you head over to iTunes? We know you're all using iPhones and iPods out there. We see it in the stats. So go and leave us some nice reviews and ratings on iTunes. I only just found them today, and there's lots of lovely messages in there from our listeners, and it made us smile and happy. So go and do that.
And your mum, right?
Yeah, well, one of them was from my mum, yes. The one that suggests that I am handsome was written by my mum. And also, thank you to Jupiter Broadcasting and Linux Academy for making it possible for Joe and Drew to edit our shows.